All right, what about Joseph? The teenage guy who was walking around town, his amazing Technicolor dream coat from Forever 21 that his dad got him. You guys remember what the writer says? It says that by faith, God used Joseph to rescue an entire nation. What about Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Samson and Gideon and Ruth and Naomi, right? And Rahab. Man, this is not really the sermon this morning, but I was rereading Hebrews chapter 11, and I just paused when I got to Rahab. If you don't know who Rahab is, you might want to buckle up. Rahab was a prostitute in the Old Testament. And it says in Hebrews 11 that Rahab was a prostitute who, by faith, and I don't know who this is for this morning, but are you really going to disqualify yourself from being used by God because of your past? Have you not heard? Has it not been told to you that the God of the Bible is the kind of God that would include a prostitute in the same narrative as Abraham and Moses? God's like, by faith, her name made it in the hall of faith. If you haven't read Hebrews chapter 11, I'm telling you right now, please, I am begging you, when you get home today, at some point after you got blooming onions at Red Robin or wherever you go for your Mother's Day lunch, just read it. Okay, you may want to buckle up before you read it because it reads literally like the writer chugged like 5 Red Bulls before he wrote it. Like it's just like boom, 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 boom. It's an amazing narrative. I want you to read it. I wish that I could read it this morning, but I can't because it's 40 verses and we will be here forever. And I want to give you the Mother's Day gift of not being too late. Okay, I might be a little late, just not too late, But here's what I want to do. We're not going to read the 40 verses in Hebrews chapter 11, but I want to show you how he concludes it. Are you guys following with me, right? So he spends 40 verses just telling us about all our heroes of the faith and how they changed the world and all that stuff. And then he ends all of that with this. And that's where we jump in Hebrews chapter 12. Listen to what he says. The writer says this. He says, therefore, right? What do we say when we see the word therefore? What's it there for, right? What the writer's doing here, he's trying to bridge what he just told us in Hebrews chapter 11 with what he's about to tell us in Hebrews chapter 12. He says this. He says, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, he says, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Let us run, he says, with perseverance, the race that's marked for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus. He is the pioneer. He's the perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he says, Jesus endured the cross. He scorned his shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Verse 3 says, let's consider him who endured such opposition from sinners so that you will not grow weary and you will not lose heart. I want to go back to verse 1 again. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw everything that hinders and the sin that entangles. And then he says this, let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Somebody say race. There is a race that the writer is saying God's marked out for you. And he's saying, I want you to run that race with perseverance. About a month or so ago, I think a whole bunch of people in here ran in the Glacier Marathon, right? I'm not going to ask for your hands, but some people, yeah, good for them. Yeah, so that's how I feel, I love it. I showed up, I was like, wow, man, a lot of people missing here. They were running the race while the rest of us were worshiping God in church because we're obviously way more spiritual than them. That's how I took it. I was like, all right, I'm just kidding. That's a joke. We're not way more spiritual than them. Just a little bit, But a whole bunch of people ran it, and I don't know if anyone else caught this, but I went home, and, it's just funny when you're sitting on your couch scrolling on social media and seeing pictures of all the people who ran a marathon or half marathon or whatever they ran, And I'm just seeing, like, all my friends are posting, and I noticed something that I don't know if I wasn't expecting it, but it kind of surprised me to see that every single person that posted something about the race not only ran the race, but they actually finished the race. Right now, obviously, it goes without saying that they didn't all run the same race and they didn't all run at the same pace, but every single person finished. Some of them ran fast, some of them ran slow, some of them walked, but every person crossed. Maybe they were lying. I don't know. I hope they weren't lying, but from what I could tell, all of them crossed the finish line, and maybe I'm just a softie, but there was something about seeing people of all ages and gender and demographics finish the race that was so inspiring. And I was just sitting in my basement, eating popcorn and thinking to myself, man, if they all could, then maybe, Right? Like, I'm like, I mean, if they could run it and these guys could actually finish it, then maybe, I mean, I know I've always told myself I'll never be able to, but maybe there's a chance that maybe someday I could run it, and not only run it, but maybe someday I could finish the race. And that's what the writer is doing in this narrative. The writer just spent 40 verses telling us about all the heroes of the faith who ran this race. And they not only ran it, but they finished it by faith. And I believe a part of what the writer is hoping will happen is that as you read Hebrews chapter 11 and you get to Hebrews chapter 12, there's something inside of you that's welling up, that's making you think, you know what, maybe. Right? I mean, if Abraham and Noah and Rahab, if these guys could not only run the race God had for them, but they could finish it by faith, maybe I could not only run the race God has for me, but could it be that there's a chance that I could actually finish the race? And so he paints this grand picture, and he's saying, now I want you to think about your race. Right? I want you to think about the same God who by faith helped them finish the race. And he's saying, I want you to run your race now that God has for you with perseverance. But here's what's interesting about this verse. If you look at it again in verse 1 and verse 2, the writer says this. He says, since we're surrounded, he says, there are two things, if you watch, that you got to do to finish your race. Okay, and this verse obviously has a whole lot more than that, but I just want to pull those two things out. He's saying, hey, if you want to run the race God has for you and you actually want to finish it, he's like, you're going to have to do two things, right? You're going to have to throw off everything that's going to hinder you, right? How does it say that? Everything that hinders you. And he says, the sin that entangles. The NLT puts it this way. I think we have it in the New Living Translation. I love the way he puts it. He says, let us strip off every weight that's going to slow us down. Now, I'm not a runner, and I've never been. Mostly because where I grew up from, you only run if something's chasing you or someone's chasing you. That's about it, you know. But here's the deal. You don't have to be a runner to understand the metaphor that he's pulling out here. Are you guys with me? He's saying, hey, there's this race that God wants you to run. And he's saying, in order for you to run this race and finish the race like all the other greats that we just talked about, you're going to have to do a couple of things. The first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to strip off all the weight that's slowing you down and the sin that trips you up. In about a month, we're going to do a series. I don't even know if I should be saying this, Jeremy. I don't know. Maybe nobody will show up. But in June, we're gonna do a series on truth. And I'm telling you right now, man, it's going to hurt before it heals. And we're going to talk about this idea that our culture doesn't like talking about. We're going to talk about sin, and we're going to talk about what it looks like when we see that in ourselves and what it looks like when we see that in the people around us and what the Bible says and how the Bible is a mirror not only into our lives, but a Bible is a mirror into our culture. And it's going to, I'm glad it's summer because it's going to get real hot in here real quick. And I can't wait for that conversation. It may just be me and Jeremy in the room by the time that series is done. But I'm truly believing that it's going to be life-changing. So we're gonna talk about that here coming in a couple weeks. But for today, I just want to, if you guys don't mind, just focus on that first part. On the part where the writer is saying that, hey, one of the things that you have to watch for as you run the race that God's calling you to run is that there are certain weights that are going to slow you down. And he said, you got to figure out how to shed those weights. Now, I know a lot of you guys are in the room. You're really smart. So you're like, you already knew where I was going with this before I even got there. But I want to make an argument, if it's okay with you guys this morning, that this thing that you guys carry around is a weight that's slowing a lot of us down in the race that God has called us to run. Full disclosure again, I know I said this earlier, but in the interest of full transparency, I feel like I just need to remind you guys again that I don't want to have this conversation any more than you do. But we kind of have to, don't we? Right? We kind of have to talk about it. At some point, we can't keep avoiding it, and we got to address the elephant in the room, which is that the reality is that this is a legitimate weight that's slowing us down. At some point, we got to have the conversation about how this little mini computer that we carry around has actually become an idol for a lot of us. A couple months ago, I was doing I do Bible time with my kids, and it's not what you think. I don't preach at my kids. I'm like, sit down and hear this 45-minute sermon. No. Like, Bible time is fun. My kids love Bible time, right? They're like, Bible time. And the reason is because my goal is to just make it as fun as possible for them, right? That's why I come up here too and tell jokes. I just want my kids to know that even though culture is going to tell them all their lives that the Bible is outdated and boring, I just want them to know, like, no, the Bible is far more interesting than you could ever imagine, and it's going to blow your mind. So my goal is to just make it fun. So here's one of the things that we do when we do Bible time in my house is that we'll read a Bible story from the kids' Bible book, right? And then we act it out in charades. And they love it, right? And so months ago, I told them the story about Elijah and the prophet of Baal. If you know that story, there's like, I think, 400 prophets, and they worship Baal, and Elijah worshiped the one true God. And so I told them this story, and I was explaining what an idol is to them, and like, we're going to act it out, and they love it. They're like, can I be this person? And Lucy is 2.5. This is a true story. Lucy's like, I want to be the prophets of Baal. And I was like, okay, this will be interesting. I promise you, I have a video of this. Maybe I'll post it later. So she grabs, Lola has this stuffed animal elephant. It's about this big. It's big, So I was telling what an idol was. And Lucy, she's 2.5. She grabs the bear, and she puts it on the ground, and she goes in front of the bear. This is a true story. And she's like, I worship Baal. I love you, Baal. Baal is the best. And I was dying. I laughed so hard. I may have peed myself just a little bit. Not a lot, just a tiny bit. I mean, it was the funniest thing. Like, and all our kids were crying, like, Baal. I'm like, okay, can we just, like, slow down? Like, you guys are getting a little carried away, right? They're like, yeah, Baal, Like, a 2.5-year-old, you know about Baal, And I think if we're honest, a lot of us think of that when we think of idols. Right? When we hear idols, we think of idols are those things where those people in the olden days bowed down to. It's just big statues they bowed down to in their underwear. That's what an idol is. But in all reality, what I'm hoping you'll see today is that the only difference between the people in the Old Testament who bowed down to Baal and us today is our idols just got a lot smaller and we can fit it in our pocket. The reality is, for a lot of us in here, this little thing that we're carrying around is far more an idol than we would like to admit. Here's how Tim Keller puts it. He's a pastor, theologian, and here's how he put it. He says, an idol is something you can't live without. You got to have it. And so it's going to drive you to break the rules you once honored, to harm others, even yourselves, in order to get it. You can't say amen, say ouch. I'm going to read it again one more time for those in the back. An idol is something that you just can't live without. Translation: if you cannot remember, and I'm preaching to myself here, the last time that you went a long time without this little thing, and or if you find yourself freaking out and going to withdrawal if you don't have it, and or if the worst case scenario in your mind is that somebody would be standing behind you looking at your phone when it gives you that report of how much time you spent on your phone that previous week, there's a chance that it's more an idol than you would like to admit. And let me bring it a little closer to home. Can I borrow your phone, Aaron? I know you don't care, so I'm going to pick on you, He's like, I got nothing. I can borrow your phone. Can you unlock it for me? Is that okay? All right, we're just going to go in front of everybody and show everybody what's up. Okay, so this is a clean phone, by the way. Wow, look at that. That's awesome. No red dots and all that stuff. Okay, so here's what I want to do is I want to let everybody know how much you've been spending your time on the phone. So do you guys want to guess what Aaron spends most of his time on? Let's see. Where is it? How do I get in there? Okay, I don't see a Bible app on here, by the way. There's no app. There's no. It's on there? Okay, all right. It's not downloaded. It's just kind of there hovering. It's like, you haven't even updated this thing in months. I'm just kidding. No. Okay. All right. So how do I find how much he spends on it? Do you want to just tell me, Ashley? I didn't hear what you were saying. You want to just... Oh, because he hides it. Oh, man, you're the worst person to pick on, all right? I was trying to embarrass you in front of everybody to just see how long. Okay, screen time. Here we go. All right. Turn on. He did turn that off. Man, this is no fun. I was looking for someone who is way worse at this than I am, I was going to be like, someone's pointing to someone over there, but I'm not going to do that, all right? They're like, take her phone, it's real bad. But let's be honest. You guys know how I don't know what happens in the Android world, but you guys know how every week, I think it's mine usually is on Sunday, like your phone will pop up that little thing to tell you how long you've been on the phone. Anybody else always look around to make sure no one's looking over your shoulders? Right? Anybody else feel just a little bit of shame? Like you get that and you're like I don't know. I don't know if I want anybody else to see how long it's taken me and how much time. This is no fun, by the way. I'm going to throw your phone at you. I was hoping to see some spicy stuff in there, but, you're not very helpful. But you guys know what I'm talking about? Right? How much time is on there and we don't want anybody to see it. Now, to be fair, like I don't think most of us set out to say, hey, this phone that I'm carrying around right here is going to be an idol. In fact, and I just want to say this just to be clear, like I don't want to be the guy that's like, boo, technology. Like, dude, there's a lot of good things that can happen because of technology. In some ways, I think it's a tool and it's a gift that even allows us to advance the gospel and the good news of Jesus Christ. So I'm not up here today to say, boo, phones. I love my phone, right? So that's not the point. I think for a lot of us, if you can go back to the time you first maybe got your first phone, I think it was for connection. Maybe like, man, I can talk to people and I can call people and we can FaceTime, and it was an amazing thing. I think for a lot of us, it started as a good thing, but then it became a God thing. And I don't know if you've noticed, but anytime good things become a God thing, they're really only good for one thing, and that is taking more from you than they promise to give. And I think we can all say that is true about our phones, not just because that is the nature of idols, is to take more than it gives, but all of the research is telling us that these little things that we're carrying around is taking far more from us than it's promising to give. And I don't want to be the guy that's up here like just, bombarding you with all the research, but I did a lot of work as I was processing this, and if it's okay with you guys, I just want to share some of the things that I found. And you can find these online, by the way. If you're like, where'd you get these? You can look them up online. There was a 2014 study that found a correlation between high social media usage and depression and anxiety. It says users, especially teens, tend to compare themselves unfavorably with their peers on social media, promoting feelings of loneliness and depression. One researcher found that the mere presence of a phone in a workplace tends to make people feel more anxious and perform poorly on given tasks. The heavier a person's phone use is, the greater the anxiety that they experience. A UK study found that people who spend a lot of time on social media are more likely to display negative personality traits, such as narcissism. Snapping endless selfies, posting all your thoughts or details about your life can create an unhealthy self-centeredness. Who would have thought? Distancing you from real-life relationships and making it harder to cope with stress. Another research says is that excessive smartphone use is associated with difficulties in cognitive emotion regulation, impulsivity, impaired cognitive function, addiction to social networking, shyness, and low self-esteem. Medical problems include sleep problems, reduced physical fitness, unhealthy eating habits, pain, migraines, reduced cognitive control, and changes in the brain's gray matter volume. Another one says this excessive smartphone use shares underlying mechanisms with other addictive behaviors such as gambling disorder. In particular, reduced cognitive control and impaired activity in the prefrontal cortex, which affects decision-making and emotional processing. This was interesting to me. Scientists have measured the amount of data that can enter the brain, and they found that an average person living today processes as much as 74 gigabytes of information in one day. To put that in perspective for you, they said only 500 years ago, 74 gigabytes of information would be what a highly educated person would consume in a lifetime through books and stories. We get that in one day. Another study said in 2011, which I'm sure it's worse now, Americans took in 5 times as much information every day as they did in 1986. It's the equivalent of 174 newspapers. Anybody remember getting newspapers? It would be like if you read 174, that's the equivalent of what we do every single day. Another research said 13% of children from intact families who are on screens less than 8 hours per day are depressed, compared to 31% of teens from non-intact families who use screens more than 8 hours per day. Common Sense Media estimates that children ages 8 to 12 spent 5.5 hours a day on screens in 2021, and teens aged 13 to 18 spent nearly 9 hours a day. Facebook's own research found that Instagram made body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teens. I'll read you one more. It says the average American today spends 7 hours and 11 minutes looking at a screen every day. Amounting to nearly 1 third of our lives feeding off that little dinner plate in our pocket, or about 109 days a year. That was in June 2022. The average American spends 109 days. Out of how many days do we have in a year? 365. Scrolling. That's what the research is telling us. And I was thinking about this week, and I was wondering to myself, I'm like, do you guys remember, anybody remember back when you could, like, people could smoke on airplanes? You guys remember that? Like, remember way back then? I mean, it's crazy to think of now, because, I mean, if I don't turn my phone off, the air person is going to karate chop me in the throat. Like, what are you doing? But there was a time where people could smoke on airplanes. And we look back and we're like, that is crazy. And again, I'm not trying to be the doom and gloom guy, but I just, as I was reading all this research, I just was thinking, man, I wonder if there's going to come a time where future generations are going to look back at our time and they're going to go, I don't believe it. Like, I wonder if there'll come a time where I don't believe that they spent 109 days every year scrolling. I wonder if there's going to be a future generation that's going to look back at you and I, if our children's children are going to look back and go, man, I don't believe that they let that little device rob them of the rest that God was offering. I wonder if we'll look back at the end of our lives and all of a sudden we'll realize that, man, what seemed so innocent actually was, like the writer says in Hebrews, a weight that actually slowed us down. And this is way above my pay grade, so I don't know exactly how this is going to work, but I know the Bible tells us that in heaven we're going to be able to recognize people and have conversations and look back at our life on earth. Again, I don't know if this is how it's going to work, but can you imagine you're in heaven and you're standing in line? I don't know if they have Starbucks in heaven. They probably do. Matt's hoping they do, because he goes about 5 times every day, you know? But can you imagine you're standing in line and you're behind one of these heroes of the faith, right? Maybe Esther or Noah, you know, and you're like, oh, man, Father Abraham, this is awesome. You know, and he's like, yeah, you know. He's like, so what did you do while you were on earth? And you're like, well, I mean, I tried to do some stuff, but, you know, to be honest with you, I spent about a third of it just scrolling. Right? And that sounds like so dramatic. But what I'm hoping to give you and I today is some perspective. Right? What I'm hoping you see today is that when the writer, again, in Hebrews chapter 12, talks about this race that we're running, it's so easy for us to think of the big things and the sinful things. And we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. But I'm telling you right now, sometimes it's the subtle things that are going to weigh you down. And what I'm hoping to propose this morning is not, let's go back to the days of the razor. Okay, and I would love that, but there are days where I'm like, man, I would love to just have a razor right now. That would be amazing. Those are the good old days. But that day, that's gone. We're not going to go back to that. But what I want to do this morning is just suggest that you and I consider how we can maybe set some boundaries and some limits in the digital world. If you missed the conversation last week, go listen to it, because it's the whole context of the rest of this talk. But the idea, if you guys remember, we looked at Exodus chapter 16, is what does God do when he takes his people into a new land? He's teaching them how to be a new people. And so he gives them boundaries. And what else does he give them? He gives them limits. And what we said last week is that we don't have to be afraid of limits limiting us, because with God, limits actually liberate us for more. And so I hope you guys have been having those conversations in your homes, and you've been talking to maybe to yourself about how you're going to set some boundaries and limits. And what I want to do for the rest of our time today, if you guys don't mind, is just challenge us to think about what it's like for us to set some of those same boundaries and limits in the digital space. If you've been around for this conversation, I've tried my best to ground it in Scripture, as Genesis chapter 1 and Exodus chapter 6 and Deuteronomy and Exodus 16. But if it's okay with you guys, I want to spend the rest of my time up here today just being uber duper practical. Can I do that? Is that okay? Can I just give us some real practical stuff that we can like sink our teeth into? Thank you. I appreciate that. I was going to do it anyways, but I always like to have, at least 3 people are like, yeah, go ahead. And so here's what I want you guys to do. There's 2 questions I want us to ask today. Right? And again, I said this last week. This is not for my sake, but write it down, take a picture with it, whatever you have to do to remember. But I think there's 2 questions that you and I are going to have to navigate in this space so it's not a weight that holds us back. This is something that I've been wrestling with on my own. And the first question that I want us to ask ourselves, that everybody in here that's holding up to carry one of this, to ask ourselves is what are the boundaries, what are my boundaries and my limits in the digital world? Right? And so if you want to strip off the weight, Paul says, I want you to strip off anything that's going to slow you down, that's going to hold you back. That don't mean that, hey, we can't have phones, but I think it does mean at some point, like we looked at last week, we have to ask the questions, do I have any boundaries? And have I set any limits? And how many of you guys know that if you don't set boundaries and you don't set limits, nobody else is going to do it for you? And so I just want to challenge us to be intentional, to not have boundaries and limits by default, but by design. And so based on the race that God has for you and based on the call God has on your life, what kind of boundaries do you need to set in place? And I'm not an expert by any means. My wife is sitting right there. I couldn't lie, even if I wanted to. But I'm not where I used to be. I'm not where I want to be, but I'm not where I used to be. And so I just want to share just some examples of some boundaries that I've put in place as I've been navigating this for years now, and you can steal them, pick and choose, come up with your own. But just to give you just maybe an idea of what it looks like to set boundaries in the digital world, one of the things that I decided years ago, it's been years now, probably 5 years I've been doing this now, is I just don't have a charger by my bed anymore. I don't charge my phone by my bed. And I heard Alex talking about this in a little band devotion in the back. But I noticed a while ago that what would happen is I would wake up in the morning, and the first thing I would do is what? Grab the phone. That's the first thing we do, right? You got to check your messages and check the weather and check the news and check Twitter and do all that other stuff. And oftentimes is the last thing that we do at night. And there's so much research out there that shows us that the first thing you do when you wake up and the last thing you do when you go to bed has a big effect on your mental health, right? I mean, a lot of us wonder why we're so anxious all day. But that's the first thing that we're stirring. So I decided years ago, one of my boundaries is I'm never going to charge. Like, I don't have a charger by my nightstand. I just don't. It's downstairs. And what that means is that I have to have interactions with human beings before I can pick my phone up, because I got kids, and I can't get past them before I can get to my phone. It's a boundary that I set. My wife and I did a couple 2-day thing like last week, and it was so weird. It's the first time in years that I plugged my phone by my bed, and I was like, this is so weird. It's a boundary that I set. Another boundary that I set, just being practical, is I have, and it's probably been, I don't know, maybe 6-7 years. Like, I don't have an email app on my phone. I just don't. I don't have any notifications that are going to show me red stuff on my phone. I just don't. And I think I can say this. I'm pretty good with email. If you email me, you hear back from me probably within a couple of days or a week. And if not, I'll tell you why. I probably have less than 10 emails in my inbox right now because I manage it well. My wife, on the other hand, could use some prayers because she has about 39,000 emails that are unread. That's why I don't look at her phone. All right, I don't have email app on my phone. My phone is always on Do Not Disturb if you ever try to call me, like 99% of the time. I know it's so annoying, but honestly, I really don't care. And I don't know who this is for out here. Like, can I just say this? Like, you don't owe anybody 24 access to you. Like, you don't owe that to anybody. That may be weird coming from a pastor. You're like, it's your job. No, it's not my job to give you 24/7 access to my life. It's my job to find a way to be there and to shepherd and to love. But you don't owe that to anybody. And this is not going to be on the slides because I just thought about it last minute. But I just want to read to you guys briefly just this story in the Gospel of Matthew just to see. They didn't have cell phones in Jesus' day as far as I could tell. But I want to read this to you, okay? If you want to look it up later, it's in Matthew chapter 12. And listen to what the writer says in verse 46 about Jesus. The writer says this. It says that while Jesus was talking to the crowd, Jesus was preaching to a crowd, Matthew chapter 12, it says his mother and his brothers, stood outside, and they wanted to speak with him. We don't know what, but his mama showed up, and his brother showed up, and there's a huge crowd, and they're like, we want to talk to Jesus, man. How are we going to get a hold of Jesus? And he said this. It says, someone came and told Jesus, your mother and your brothers are standing outside, and they want to speak to you. And you would think that Jesus would shut down the thing and be like, all right, sorry, guys, mama's here. I love my mama, and he loved his mama. But listen to Jesus' response. Jesus said to them, who is my mother and who are my brothers? How awkward is that? Can you imagine being his brother, and you're in the back. You're like, hey, I'm calling right now. Hey, it's me, And Jesus is sitting up there, and it comes up, mama, And he just, sent to voicemail. He said, who are my mother, who are my brothers? Then he pointed to his disciples and said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of the Father in heaven is my brother and my sister and my mother. Jesus wasn't being dismissive or disrespectful to his mom and his brothers. Jesus was setting a boundary. Jesus was saying, man, I got work to do that God's called me to do. And so I'm going to send you the voicemail, Mama. We can talk later. We'll go to Applebee's and hang out later. But right now I got something to do. You got to set boundaries. My phone's always do not disturb. Here's another one that I've been doing lately. And I don't do so great in this one, but like no scrolling in the bathroom. And I'm telling you right now, I forgot how boring it is. I'm telling you, you try it. Like I could be in there for hours before, and now I'm like, what do I do here? There's nothing to do but what you came in to do, Seriously. Like I'm like I just want to bound. I'm like, I'm just not going to scroll when I go in the bathroom, The other day, my wife's like, are you scrolling? I thought you weren't scrolling there. I'm like, no, I'm not. Right? We got to set boundaries. Not only do we have to set boundaries, but I want to talk briefly about what it looks like for us to set limits. Right? Limits are about our pace and about how fast we go, right? I was driving to church this morning, and some lady was, like, right on my tail. She was riding me, and I was like, I'm going 40, and it's 35 in Sylvania with construction. I'm like, what is going on? Like, why are you, like, on my tail? And finally got to 2 lanes, and she just cut over and just, And I looked over, and it's this really, really old lady. And I was like, man, I saluted. I was like, that's gangster right there. I'm like, respect. She's like, get out of my way, you little youngin', And she was booking it. Right? And I kept looking at my speed like I am going 5 over. Right? And that's what limits do. Right? Limits, it's not just boundaries of staying in the road. Limits tell you how fast you're going. And one of the things that we have to navigate in the digital world is our limits. I want to give you some examples of some of the things that we do. I started this just several months ago. I set a limit. You can set a limit. I don't know if you can do this on Android phones, but an iPhone, you can set a limit for social media. Do you guys know this? I want to show you a picture of the other day. You can set a limit. I set a limit. Just ignore the first part. That's our fantasy football thing. But listen, it says 5 minutes remaining on Facebook, Instagram, and 1 more today. Right? I set a limit every day. I can't spend more than an hour on all of those social media sites. Now, notice it is 9:57 a.m. And I had 5 minutes left. So you can guess what I was doing that morning, Right? But it's a limit. It's a limit. It tells you, hey, you're going a little bit too fast. You can set a limit on that. Another limit I have, you can take that off of there, is there's this thing I put on my phone, and from 10 to 8, my phone just basically shuts off. I don't know if you can do that. You know that or not. Like 10 o'clock, all the apps, everything just shuts down. Now, you can bypass it, but it takes a lot of work. And it doesn't come on until 8 in the morning. One limit that my wife and I have set, and I just want to spend a little more time talking about this, is we set a limit for our kids. Right? It's called screen time. Right? And they fight us all the time. Right? And they're like, the other day, Eden's like, I got to get on there, just let screen time. I'm like, no, go figure something out. She's like, it's boring. Like, the problem is it's boring here. I'm like, no, the problem is not that it's boring. The problem is that you're boring, okay? Like, and my wife doesn't like it when I say stuff like that. I'm like, and I will tell him, I'm like, I will come in your room if you say that again with a bag, and I will bag all of these toys that are boring, and I'm going to throw it in a dumpster. And they're like, no. And I'm like, okay, go find something. Does anybody remember, anybody old enough when you were kids and my mom's watching, your parents would make you leave the house and say, don't come back for 4 to 5 hours? Like, my mom's like, you cannot come back till dinner. And I was like, what am I supposed to do? We didn't have any screens, It's just me, my brothers, and sticks, We're like, we got to figure this out for 6 hours, right? And my kids, if they could, they would spend all day just staring at the thing. But my wife and I are trying to figure out how to navigate. We got to put limits. And I should probably qualify this next part, like because it's Mother's Day, and I want to be careful how I say this. So let me start by saying that parenting is hard. Amen? It's real hard. Really, really hard. Doesn't matter what season of life you're in. Some of you got babies and you haven't slept more than 2 hours in months, and God bless you. Right? I mean, some of you got a lot of kids, and they're always on top of you. Some of you got teenagers who all of a sudden, between 14 and 15, they're a lot smarter than you. Like, I don't know that happened. They're just a genius all of a sudden. They know how to do everything, right? It is hard to parent whatever season of life you're in, and we need the grace of God to be able to parent well. Now, having said all of that, I will not be a good pastor and a good shepherd if I don't call us out for having an iPad, parent our kids, because we haven't given ourselves the margin and the rest that we need to lead and parent them well. Right? I would not be a good pastor if I don't come up here and just say, hey, as we're having the conversation, we have to acknowledge, parents, that it doesn't really make any sense that when our kids are yay tall, we just shove a screen in their face, and somehow when they get older and that's all they want to do, we're mad. That doesn't make any sense. And I'm not trying to be, I know nobody wants to hear this, but I'm telling you right now, if you're a parent, especially of a kid who is growing, we are in for a rude awakening if we underestimate the havoc that this little device that we give our kids can cause in the lives of our kids in the future. Okay, and I'm not just saying that from someone who's been through that. I'm saying it because I have seen it over and over and over again. I did spiritual emphasis for Toledo Christian in this very room several months ago. I came here and I preached and I talked about following Jesus, and I challenged this 180 or so high school kids to say, hey, there are things that you got to leave behind to follow Jesus. And I told a little bit about my story, about some of the struggles I had. Specifically, I talked about some of my struggles with pornography back in the day and how God rescued me. And I told them, that, hey, Jesus can save you from everything. And afterwards, I said, if you want to talk or pray, I'm going to be here on the side. And I went by the side of that wall, and I probably had about 10 or so students come up and just talk to me. And I'm not exaggerating, all but maybe one of them was like, man, I'm struggling. Man, I got into some things that I feel stuck. I feel caught. All of them felt the pull of pornography and some kind of sexual trap that they fell into on their phone. And they're looking at me saying, can you pray with me? And what broke my heart is that so many of these kids, they're trying. Okay, so let me just say that if you're in high school, man, I look up to you. Like it is hard to be a teenager in 2023. Like it is. Like when I was in high school, you had to work for it. You had to be creative. But today, it's all right here. And all of the kids that I talk to standing by that wall, they're all trying. Like they're not just like, I want to do whatever I want to do. They're like, man, I know that God has more for me. And I just feel stuck. And I just want to challenge all of the parents in the room, and I know it's hard, and your kids aren't going to like it. They may even say, I hate you for doing this, and I'm praying that God will give you the grace to have the confidence to be able to just step right over that and understand that there is a tension that we have to figure out between protecting their privacy but also protecting them. And so we have to think, not only do we got to set limits for ourselves, but I'm telling you, if you're parenting children, you have to constantly ask yourself, what limits do I need to set for my children? Because if you don't, you and I are in for a rude awakening. And it breaks my heart to think that so many of these kids who are trying their very best to love God and live a life that honors Him are going to end up with a full-blown addiction years from now. A lot of mental health issues because, I don't know, there's nobody in their lives to step in and go, hey, we got to set some limits and we got to set some boundaries. And you don't have to like it, but someday, hopefully, you'll look back and you'll thank me. Paul says there are some things that are going to hold you back. One of it is weights. How do we do that? We got to think boundaries and we got to think limits. And then the second question in closing that I want us to ask ourselves is, what am I looking for? What am I looking for? My friend Chris asked me this question years ago, and I was talking to him about some of my social media and phone. I'm like, I'm just trying to be, and he said he read this somewhere. I don't know who I'd give him credit, but he said someone told him once that anytime you find and this is going to be annoying, because he told me, I was like, thanks for telling me that. It's annoying, but it's very helpful. So it's going to annoy you too. But every time you're on your phone, every time you're scrolling on Instagram or whatever it is that you're doing, he's like, ask yourself, what are you looking for? And when he first said that, I was like, I don't know what that means. And literally the other day, I'm on there. And it's like, what am I looking for? 99.99999% of the time, the answer is, I don't know. Anybody? I'm not looking for anything. Right? It's like my wife going to Target. I don't think she's looking for anything. It's just a part of her routine. She just shows up every Friday with a cart. Like, let's see if something exciting happens, you know? That's what, it's just a part of life. And I think for a lot of us, that's what the phone is. We just grab it and we don't know what else to do with our hands. We just grab it and we just scroll. And I'm telling you right now, you ask yourself that question, and most of the time I'm like, I don't know what I'm looking for. I don't know why I'm on Instagram. I'm not on there because I'm like, man, I want to encourage somebody. I want to be encouraged. I want to see what God's doing in the life of somebody. I want to take, no, we're just like mindlessly scrolling. And while, I don't know, you could argue that is anything really wrong with mindlessly scrolling? I don't know. That's a different conversation maybe for a different day. But here's the bigger story, okay? Here's the bigger story. It's 109 days out of the year. And so what that means for you and I is that this is what we're fixated on. It may not feel like much in that moment, but the cumulative effect is that we spend so much time fixated on our phone and we don't even know what we're looking for. And I don't know if you caught it or not, if you can go back, Melissa, to that verse, but listen to what the writer says in Hebrews chapter 12. He says, here's how you run the race. Here's how you finish the race. He says, not only do I want you to throw off everything that hinders and the sin that entangles and run with perseverance. And then the next verse, what does it say, Melissa? He says this. He says, I want you to fix your eyes on who? Jesus. The Message paraphrase says, look only to Jesus. And so the writer's prescription for laying off the weight and for not being tripped off by sin is not necessarily to even focus on the weight or to focus on the sin. No, his prescription is to focus on Jesus. Right? And the image I had driving here today was just, I think a lot of us are just, this is where our focus is most of the time. And I just imagine Jesus just all around us, like we just sang, and he is working, and he is moving, and he is changing hearts, and he's transforming the world, and he's standing to go, hello, hey, hello, and we're like, hang on a second, I'm scrolling. I don't even know what I'm scrolling for. I don't know. And the writer comes in. He says, I want you to shift your focus on Jesus. It sounds so simple, but what if it is that simple? What if at the end of the day, this is a conversation about focus? And God's saying, where is your focus? What are you looking at? I want you to shift your eyes. I'm not saying you should never look or scroll. You can do that, but I want your primary focus to be on me. And I'm preaching to the choir here, but I'm telling you right now, you guys know this, but Jesus is so much more amazing and more beautiful than anything the world could ever know. Jesus is the greatest being in the world. Jesus is life. He is grace. He is mercy. He is good. He is so much more satisfying than anything the world could ever offer. And he is there at our front door, and he is knocking, saying, you let me in and I will blow your mind. You may be going through the hardest time in your life, but I am right there with you in the fire. I am with you in the storm. I am carrying you when you cannot walk, but you can't see me if you spend 109 days staring at your phone. So he's saying, look, can we fix our eyes? I don't want anybody to feel shame or condemnation today. I'm there with you. But I do want you to feel some conviction. I want us to feel conviction that leads to repentance, to change. I want some of us to not only feel conviction, I want some of us to confess this as sin. And I've been talking a little bit how, boundaries and limits, and those things are true. But for some of us, this has actually become sinful. For some of us, it's a gateway to sin. It's a gateway to feed in the flesh. And God's saying, I need you to lay that down. Right? Don't just set limits and boundaries. I need you to surrender that. You surrendered your heart to me and your life to me. Can you surrender this digital space? Can you agree that I'm better? I'm better. It says, fix your eyes on Jesus. He's the pioneer and he's the perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. He scorned its shame. And he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. What an image. And then he says this. He says, I want you to consider him who endured such opposition from sinners so that you will not grow weary and you will not lose heart. If you're weary and losing heart, he's saying, look to Jesus.